First, I would like to sincerely thank Professor Naglis and Julius Figeris for invitation to this magnificent conference. And Professor Naglis, without your presence, inspiration and encouragement, Lithuanian philosophical life would have been very dull and bleak. Thank you very much. First, I will read my paper and then I will ask some questions. Myth as proto-philosophy. Some considerations on the philosophical aspects of myth. Many history of philosophy begins with the foundational myth created not by the ancient Greeks themselves, but by the classical scholars of the 19th century, of the birth of philosophy, which has supposedly emerged from the medium of dim and unarticulated thought as a result of the victory of the nascent Greek logos over the fading Greek mythos. Since then, the invented story of the mortal struggle between the irrational logos and the irrational mythos, the story based on too sharp a distinction between the logos and the mythos, has become a staple for uncritical scholarly minds. A tendency to view myth as an enemy of philosophy is evident even in the writings of some eminent classical scholars. As an example of such a tendency, I would like to quote a passage from Geoffrey Stephen Kirk, who in his book The Nature of Greek Myths strongly criticizes Plato's strategy of employing myths for philosophical reasons. On page 108 of his book, Kirk writes, quote, "It is always difficult to tell in the earlier Platonic dialogues which ideas belong to Socrates and which to Plato, but probably the habit of falling back on myths as an emotive form of persuasion belonged to Socrates himself. He is shown in Plato's Phaedo, for example, as crowning some rather inadequate proofs of the soul's immortality by a lyrical myth about the jewel-studded landscapes of the afterlife. The proofs were partly Plato's, but the myth may have been Socrates' own. In any case, Plato does not disdain to develop the tendency in other eschatological visions in the Gorgias, the Phaedrus, and the last book of the Republic. Some may feel, as I do, that Plato might have done better to work a bit harder on the philosophical arguments before resorting to the traditional device of the persuasive myth. But that is what he tended to do, and he was thereby succumbing on an almost irresistible force in Greek culture, to what he himself called poetry, including myth, as the natural enemy of philosophy, unquote. It is important to add here that Kirk is not alone among scholars when he passes such judgments against Plato and other ancient philosophers who acknowledge the philosophical potential of myth and who methodically use myth as a weak vehicle of philosophical point and as a special non-discursive mode of philosophical argument. Having in mind the very words of the title of Kirk's book, The Nature of Greek Myths, it is ironic that such an otherwise outstanding scholar as Kirk is so absolutely blind to the philosophical potential of myth, especially the potential of Plato's philosophical myth as a special form of myth invented by Plato himself. Therefore, it seems that in this respect, Kirk is blind to the nature of Greek myths. It is important to observe here that Plato's philosophical myths are an innovative blend of traditional Greek myths and Plato's own philosophical visions and visionary insights rendered in a highly poetic form. These innovative myths, invented partly by Plato himself, are always employed by the philosopher to show some very important philosophical point that cannot be presented otherwise. For example, argued strictly discursively. Plato involves his philosophical myths, that is, to ironically use Kirk's phrase, falls back on myth whenever a discursive argument developed by Socrates or some other interlocutor, an argument that used to be efficient up to some point in the discussion, is stuck up for logical or conceptual reasons in some aporia and proves to be impotent, inadequate in subsequent part of the discussion. Therefore, in order for Plato to make his philosophical point, the mode of myth is absolutely necessary, simply inescapable. Unfortunately, so many classical scholars, especially those belonging to the analytic tradition within the research into the history of philosophy, fail to appreciate the crucial part that myth plays in the fabric of philosophical reasoning. Yet my claim in this presentation is that all myths, not only philosophical myths such as those invented and employed by Plato, have a huge philosophical potential. And what is even more important is that myth reveals its philosophical potential not only in strictly and specifically philosophical contexts, such as Platonic dialogues or the fragments of the pre-Socratic philosophers, but also in other contexts. In fact, in all possible contexts, for example, those of epic literature, drama, and the visual arts. Though the beginnings of ancient Greek philosophy are linked with the names of Thales, Anaximander, and Pythagoras, it is only natural to suppose that the pre-Socratic thought was not born in an empty place, out of nothing, and had some anticipation in the pre-philosophical, both oral and textual tradition of the archaic and early classical periods of ancient Greek culture. The overemphasis on the mythos-logos distinction loses its credibility when we draw our attention to the fact that, contrary to traditional scholarly expectation, we find the most powerful anticipation of Greek philosophy, namely in those texts belonging to the archaic period that are most mythological in their content and way of expression. For example, already a few decades ago, some scholars expressed an opinion that the theogony of Hesiod and many conceptual similarities with theogony, those similarities that are indirectly influenced, that have influenced the early cosmological systems of Milesian philosophers, have their own philosophical potential. It is also important to note that if we expect to find some anticipation of philosophy in Homer, we should look at those places in the Iliad and especially the Odyssey that have some relation to mythology, or where the poet, whoever he or she might have been, expressly deals with certain mythological themes. For instance, a brief yet colorful description of the cave of the nymphs found at the beginning of the 13th book of the Odyssey, already in late antiquity attracted the attention of some Neoplatonists, such as Porphyry, who interpreted this passage in the philosophical light, comparing this cave and its layout with the whole of the cosmos, with its different levels. In the Odyssey, the Homeric description of Odysseus' wanderings in the faraway imaginary lands and islands, either mythical or semi-mythical, located in the far west or only in the poet's imagination, as well as the crucial events that took place in those outlandish landscapes, have far greater potential of philosophical meaning and philosophical interpretation than any ordinary or realistic happening presented by Homer in this poem. To a somewhat lesser degree, the same might be said about the Iliad. Therefore, Hesiod's theogony is a precursor of Milesian cosmological systems, and Homer is also an author. Whoever he or she may have been is a precursor of Neoplatonic musings about the nature of the cosmos. The etymology of the Greek word Filosofija reveals that the ancient Greeks themselves viewed philosophy as love of wisdom. It is very important to have in mind that initially philosophy was thought of as love of wisdom and not as love of sheer knowledge, though Aristotle at the beginning of his metaphysics says, Anthropoi pantes tu eidene oregonte fuse. All men by their very nature strive for knowledge, but he's oblivious of the initial meaning of the word Filosofija. So this circumstance is very crucial, for not all possible knowledge is conducive to wisdom and is crowned by it. Philosophy is about wisdom, not about knowledge. Had the Greeks conceived of philosophy as love of knowledge sheer and simple, they would have chosen an appropriate word for this kind of intellectual enterprise, naming it, for example, philomatia, instead of philosophy, Filosofija. Primitive positivistic explanations of the origins and nature of philosophy tend to overemphasize its similarity to science, viewing philosophy not as sui generis intellectual enterprise, but only as a cradle of positivistic science, even as some sort of proto-science, and at the same time, rather condescendingly, as childish or adolescent not yet science. It is far more relevant to say that philosophy, like myth, deals in wisdom and loves wisdom. That to say, to say like science, that deals with knowledge and hard facts. Science loves knowledge and philosophy, and myth love wisdom. Although philosophy, without doubt, has some similarity to science, because truth is important both to science and to philosophy. This similarity is less essential and less important than philosophy's similarity to myth. Philosophy is much more similar to myth than it is similar to science. Of course, myth cannot be viewed as philosophy sensu stricto, yet there is reason to think of it as some sort of archaic proto-philosophy. But in what sense are we entitled to speak of myth as proto-philosophy? In order to answer this question, we should look for some traits of specific love of wisdom that might be found as inherent in the inner nature of myth as such. If found in the very nature and essence of myth, this love of wisdom, which, as we have mentioned, is also characteristic of philosophy, would reveal the fundamental similarity between myth and philosophy. First of all, both myth and philosophy, as conceived initially by the Greeks, unlike positive science, aims to view, to contemplate theoretically the whole of reality, not any isolated part of it. Even if they are interested in some part of reality, they view it not in isolation, but in relation to other parts and the whole of reality. We might say that both philosophical theoria and mythical theoria aim at construing theoretical visions of the world as holistic spatial wholes that are contemplated with physical or metaphysical eyes, or with the eyes of sheer imagination. Both philosophy and myth, unlike science, are concerned with meaning and not with the empirical facts. And this preoccupation, characteristic of both myth and philosophy, with theoretical holistic vision of reality, stems from the fact that, as we well know, only deeply integrated, densely contextually interwoven organic wholes have a potential to become meaningful, not mechanistic systems comprised of atomized or isolated elements. Sense or meaning stems from the whole, and this understanding of the whole engenders Sophia, wisdom. Theoretically contemplated wholes are the wholes that are arranged spatially. Yet the wholes that are of interest both to myth and philosophy might be arranged not only spatially but also temporally. This is the reason why both philosophy and myth are so concerned with narrative, which, taken in its entirety, might be thought of as a temporal whole. As we know, philosophy is cultivated in the medium of language and construed as a discourse, and every discourse is a temporally arranged sequence of discursive elements that are glued together with the glue of meaning. This meaning gradually evolves in the process of narration. Myth, like philosophy, is also concerned with narration, yet this is an understatement, for myth, in its most fundamental sense, is narrative. Mythos is narrative, like epos and logos. Aristotle speaks about it in his Poetics. So, Aristotle in his Poetics defines the Greek word mythos as a plot of tragedy, and this plot is viewed as all its sequentially arranged elements. It is important to observe that both philosophical and mythical narrative is a sequentially construed temporal whole which engenders meaning by the very process of narration, by way of gluing together all the discursive elements with the glue of gradually evolving unified vision. Philosophical and mythical narrative is very similar to philosophical and mythical theoria, in that they both are employed as the vehicles or instruments of the creation of meaning by way of wholes, arranged either spatially or temporally. This similarity in terms of theoria and narrative between philosophy and myth gives an ample reason to consider myth as a sort of proto-philosophy. So myth acts like theoria, but temporally, not spatially. Another interesting feature of myth is its preoccupation with existential themes. Myths are dealing with the most fundamental human desires, longings, problems, disasters, anxieties, challenges, and temptations. And mythical heroes are presented as facing up to and ultimately overcoming the most serious challenges that spell life or death, both for them personally or for the communities they represent. Myth is concerned with problem solving on personal, communal, and societal levels. Therefore, we might even say that in this sense, myth is a precursor of existential philosophy. The dangers of human extravagance, hubris, the importance of limits and moderation in human life, the irony of destiny, the fleeting nature of time and life, the impermanence of luck and human success, these are other existential themes that are most seriously dealt with in the medium of myth. It is not a coincidence that contemporary writers in existentialist tradition so frequently turn to Greek myths for inspiration and employ in their writings entire mythical stories. We are accustomed to think that, chronologically, existential philosophy comes later than essentialist philosophy, viewed as metaphysics. Philosophical essentialism or metaphysics is usually and generally quite correctly considered as an achievement of ancient Greek thought, and the beginnings of existential philosophy are traced back to the 19th century, to the writings of Kierkegaard. Strangely enough, in Greek culture itself, namely in the realm of Greek myth and epic tradition imbued with mythical themes, we first encounter existential proto-philosophy, and only somewhat later in the writings of the first true philosophers find the anticipation of Greek essentialism. Therefore, myth is concerned not only with theoria that creates meaning by way of construing holistic visions of reality. Existential proto-philosophy, myth is also concerned with praxis, with a practical action and practical reason aimed at problem solving and resourceful dealing with the most challenging situations of human life. This striking similarity between myth and philosophy gives us yet another reason to view myth as proto-philosophy, this time a practical one. The world of myth is a world of wonder, so much so that we might say that myth originates in the experience of wonder and is grounded in wonder. Myths tell us about all sorts of imaginary lands, outlandish lands, the lands of wonder, or wonderlands as they are called in fairy tales. The same holds true of philosophy. As Aristotle has pointed out in his Metaphysics, and as most philosophers know from their own experience without the Stagirite's aid, philosophy as a form of human endeavor also originates from wonder and is most fundamentally grounded in wonder. There is reason to say that wonder is the most basic and most important common denominator of myth and philosophy. Yet we might also notice a slight difference between them, for perhaps we might say that myth begins with wonder and ends with wonder, while philosophy begins with wonder and supposedly ends with some image or semblance of truth or otherwise. This similarity in terms of their relation to wonder between myth and philosophy provides some additional corroboration to our claim that myth is a sort of archaic proto-philosophy. Myth usually presents and reveals what is true in terms of strange, inverted, and alternative. Mythic worlds are strange worlds. They are often presented in the medium of myth as alternative versions of our real or supposedly more real world that we encounter in our everyday experience. Having these alternatives, however strange and seemingly impossible in mind, alternatives that have been disclosed to us in the sphere of myth, we are able to start the process of rationally thinking out and practically implementing the best possible alternative in our real world. In this sense, myth is very similar to philosophy conceived as a critical reflection on the condition of our world and society, and especially to philosophy viewed as critical theory whose aim is to offer alternative visions of society, social and political order, and alternative scenarios of our future development, both as members of society and individual human beings. As a medium of man's relation to the world, myth has its own peculiar logic and dialectic. Some myths are even structured dialectically in Hegelian sense, that is, they have a tripartite form that might be described in terms of a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis. The thesis part of such myths tell us about the condition of the cosmos and society prior to some disturbance or existential challenge or existential threat. The antithesis part tells us about a particular cosmic or societal catastrophe or disturbance of the cosmic or societal order or some existential threat. And finally, the synthesis part of such myths tells about the overcoming or some sort of dialectical resolving of that cosmic or societal upheaval. The main hero of a myth that has such tripartite form is a person who brings about the resolution of a cosmic or societal conflict and reinstates, with some subtle modifications, the initial order of the world. Yet many myths are not only structured dialectically, but also are dialectical in terms of the content of their narrative. That is, such myths convey a proto-philosophical message that might be understood dialectically. For example, in the sphere of myth, we observe a peculiar dialectic of life and death. This dialectic is characteristic of a cosmic process where life and death form a cyclically revolving continuum. In the sphere of myth, life continually merges into death, and death in its own turn merges into life. Such curious interpenetration of life and death is a universal feature of mythical world outlook. For example, in the symbolism of Neolithic Europe and the Neolithic Near East, the usual symbols of death convey not only the idea of death itself, but also the idea of subsequent regeneration and future life. While Neolithic symbols of life in their own turn not only point to the exuberance of life forces, but also foreshadow the waning of life and subsequent death. It is reason to believe that the Neolithic symbols of death and the myths related to them were as ambivalent and dialectically charged as the symbols and myths of life. In this sense, we might say that the ancient myth and symbol have their own proto-dialectic that is quite similar to the form of dialectic that we find at the beginnings of classical Greek thought in the corpus of pre-Socratic philosophy. It goes without saying that the very fact that myth is proto-dialectical in its deepest nature strengthens our view that myth is some sort of archaic proto-philosophy. For we know that the link between philosophy and dialectic is the most fundamental one. Myth is a vivid and powerful phenomenon, or rather a universe of various fascinating phenomena. We should distinguish between myth as a narrated or sung or visually presented phenomenon, that is, myth as phenomenon within culture, or cultural phenomenon, and myth as related to and focused on that revealed phenomenon that emerges in human experience and shows up in myth. There are two planes, two levels of speaking about myth as a phenomenon. Myth as such a cultural phenomenon, and myth is arranged around that phenomenon of experience, experiential phenomenon that gives rise to myth. Therefore, it is not true that we simply imagine, conjure up a phenomenon as though from nothing, or create it from nothing and then narrate a story about it in the medium of myth. In other words, we do not construct and cannot construct phenomena, consciously or subconsciously, from nothing or from pure imagination, in the medium of language, and then construe or interpret these supposedly purely linguistic creations as myth. Rather, we face some real phenomena in the real world, and those phenomena attract our attention and our imagination. And from this encounter between real phenomena and our own powers of imagination emerges a myth as a narrative story, a song, dance, or some creation of visual art. When we create, but not simply construct from nothing or from pure language, a myth as some story or picture or song, then it becomes a phenomenon in its own right, a cultural phenomenon, a phenomenon of a different secondary order in relation to primary phenomenon that showed up in our experience. In the first place, fascinated us, captured our imagination, and then took form in linguistic or other medium as a narrated story. I would even say that we should approach phenomenology, the whole of phenomenology, from the standpoint of myth. For myth, in its very nature, in its very essence, though we cannot speak about essences in a phenomenological sense, is a perfect phenomenon, or a domain of perfect phenomena, to be described and investigated by the phenomenologists. As we know, essentialist philosophy tries to think with pure disembodied mind and from the perspective of pure disembodied spirit. In this respect, phenomenological philosophy is rather different. It endeavors to think in such a way that the process of thought involves the entire human being, entire human person, both his or her mind and body, without too sharp a distinction between them. We as phenomenologists try to think, or should try to think, both with our minds and bodies. The same is true when we speak about our sensations, perceptions, and our feelings, our emotions. We as phenomenologists try to feel, or should try to feel, the world not only with our pure bodies, that are usually thought of as devoid of any spiritual or intellective element, but both with our bodies and minds without too sharp a distinction between them. When we approach the world in such a way, the phenomena of the world acquire a capacity to attract our attention, to attract us more powerfully than before. They pull our entire being, body and mind, body and soul into their orbit, and then, enchanted and bewitched by these phenomena, we, oblivious of ourselves, start to narrate our myths. In archaic societies, myth engenders an acutely responsive and responsible ecological consciousness. It takes control not only of the minds and bodies of those who create and tell mythic stories, but also of their entire surroundings, their natural environments. For instance, the Alcharinga, or dream time, that we encounter in the myths of Australian Aboriginal peoples gives meaning to various features of landscape: hills, rocks, stones, lakes, brooks, and so on, creating a meaningful whole of their surroundings and imbuing them with significance that gives rise to environmentally oriented ecological consciousness. Thus, Australian Aboriginal myths that tell of dreamtime provide their narrators with a blueprint that not only makes sense of their spatial and temporal being, the environment and their mythic history, but also enables them to view their surroundings as an extended body or an entire extended person that they should treat with respect and take care of. Phenomenologically speaking, the mythic dreaming in Alcharinga terms creates a spatially wide and temporally deep living world for the native peoples of Australia. In this sense, the representatives of native Australian peoples think and feel and encounter the phenomena of the living world not only with their own minds and their own physical bodies, but also with their extended bodies and minds, that is, with their natural surroundings and their entire ecological environments. Having in mind that we differentiate between science and philosophy on the grounds that science thinks from the standpoint of pure mind, while philosophy, especially phenomenological philosophy, thinks from the perspective of our entire human person, involving both his or her mind and body, there is reason to make a conclusion that the mythic way of thinking and encountering the phenomena of the world is even more philosophical and phenomenological than philosophy and phenomenology sensu stricta in a narrower sense. in that the mythic way of thought involves in the process of experiencing the world and encountering the phenomena not only human minds and bodies, but also their environments as though they were their own extensions, the extensions of human bodies and human minds, or the extensions of human communities and societies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for such a rich and comprehensive presentation about myth. And maybe I start from the first question. I like so much this phenomenological attitude that myth is so inspiring that it intensively gives possibility to of perception of phenomenon, and even more phenomenological when we approach only with this conceptual thinking. And want to come back to this place where we was talking about wonder, and that myth is starting with wonder and ending with wonder. However, philosophy is starting with wonder and ending with some conceptual or some truth or lie. Yes. Maybe you can explicate this space a little wider, and why myth? Because we still have rational answer from both, and with this phenomenological attitude, we see that in fact we are even deeper in the world than we are in mythical consciousness. So where maybe you can explicate a little more nuance to this difference.
I think that myth provides such answers that are more open-ended, and philosophy and especially science give closed answers, and therefore we start with wonder in philosophy, sometimes in science, when we speak about black holes or gravitational waves or Higgs's boson and so on. We also start with wonder in science. But we are left with a closed answer, with a definitive answer, or open or closed answer. And in mythical sphere, we are given answers, but they are open-ended. They continually providing a possibility to extend our understanding, to extend our imaginative powers and our powers of imagination, and we are left with some vision of the world, and we are left with some sort of enigma that is to be resolved in the future. Therefore, this wonder continues. A myth provides an answer that is pregnant with meaning and is pregnant with enigma. And this enigma enables to feel that we are in the region of wonder, that we have not left the region or sphere of wonder. So wonder continues, and therefore myth is so fascinating. We are given some answers in mythology. Myth gives us some answers, but those answers are presented in a visual or narrative form, and this form is only partially conceptual. It is presented in a richer form or format, and therefore a truth comes, or answer that is true or supposedly true, comes with an encouragement to go deeper into the world and to explore those phenomena more in depth and in the future. Therefore, I think that a myth is a much richer medium for thought, and therefore I think that phenomenology should view myth as a domain of, as I have said, perfect phenomena or pure phenomena. Therefore, I think that myths, mythology should be viewed as a source of inspiration for phenomenology and philosophy in general, and we should not be dismissive of myth and should not speak of myth condescendingly. To say that it is a pre-philosophical phase of dealing with the world, that logos is better than myth. We should view a myth with respect, and when we view myth with respect, it enriches us greatly, and we have a capacity to inquire into the world both conceptually and visually, and with the help of all our senses, and view our world as an endless journey, endless deep, endless ocean of wonder, of mystery, and we are enabled to view the world as a source of far richer being than science and, for example, analytic philosophy gives a reason to view the world in such a way. I think that in myth we combine knowledge and the joy of living. Imagination as such combines possible knowledge, possible anticipation of possible states of the world, and the sheer joy of living, of being, and I think that myth is a sphere of dialectical interpenetration between being and knowledge. Plato's Philebus spoke of a mixus, which combines knowledge and hedonia, pleasure. So I think that myth as a phenomenon or a domain of phenomena is a sphere where knowledge or inquiry combines with pleasure, with the joy of being, and therefore I think that phenomenology should focus on myth because we say that contrary to science, wherein we think with our pure, disembodied, pure minds that are devoid of sensual or bodily element. In the sphere of myth and in phenomenology, we think both with our body and mind, with thought and sensual elements of our personality, and we feel the world not only with our senses but also with our mind. The cosmos is imbued with meaning, and it is alive. It is not a conglomerate of atoms, strings, subatomic particles. It is a living being, as is presented in Plato's Timaeus. So we should think both with our minds and with our senses, and to sense the world not only with the senses but also with our minds, with our intellectual capacities. Thank you.
exploration. I was wondering, since you noticed that Aristotle describes myth by relating it to the tragic narrative, or relating it to the tragic element as inherently belonging to the structure of the myth, I was wondering, would you ascribe tragic character in this sense to philosophical enterprise, as Aristotle related it to the myth, and in what sense?
Yeah. Aristotle spoke of myth as a plot of tragedy, not relating myth with some tragic character, but with a plot of dramatic composition. But I think that in the context of tragedy, in the essence of tragedy, there are some elements that are of importance, of utmost importance to philosophy, both to philosophy and to myth, to mythology, because tragedy as such is highly dialectical. It is existential, and as I spoke, mythology, primeval mythology, primal mythology is very existential, and philosophy also, in its course, moved from the essentialist standpoint or perspective to the existentialist standpoint or perspective. Therefore, tragedy as such is existential, highly existential thing. And having in mind that philosophy has to do with existential themes and myth has to do with existential themes, it's clear that tragedy as such is very, very important, both to myth and to philosophy. But Aristotle in his Poetics spoke of mythos as the plot or fabula of tragedy in somewhat different sense, but we may extend this conception into other regions and to interpret quite differently, or to add some new nuances to Aristotle's analysis.
I'm sorry I stuck out like a sore thumb, but I have a question both for myth and philosophy. Is there, in both cases, a number of things? One, that we regard the universe, whether in mythology and whether in philosophy, as a whole, and we have mythologies and philosophies as variants, as efforts in our awareness in multiple ways to integrate our knowledge and to disclose that whole. No matter which way you slice it, it's the same thing. Eidetic invariant.
I think that the most fascinating thing here is that both in philosophy and in mythology we deal with partial wholes. For example, we view the night sky, which discloses itself as a whole, yet we know that we do not possess the whole, the complete knowledge about all of the stars and nebulae and so on. This is a partial understanding and partial vision, yet it is the whole vision. We lift our eyes and look at the sky, and it discloses itself as a whole. And we view this night sky, or for that matter, a day sky, as a whole. And the same holds true in philosophy. We are dealing with, I should say, gestalts of reality. We see some parts and construe the whole from those parts with insufficient knowledge. And therefore, both myth and philosophy have an advantage with regard to science, in respect of science. Because science cannot arrive at such conclusions that would have philosophical generality. Science cannot arrive at a world outlook because they start with details, with facts, with empirical facts, and their generalizations are only hypotheses. They cannot build a world outlook with the help of empirical data, of empirical facts, or those theoretical constructions or propositions that are arrived at with the help of those empirical data, empirical facts. Therefore, if they construe some sort of world outlook, it is with an element of philosophy. For example, scientifically, positivistically oriented scientist or philosopher speaks about a scientific world outlook, and this is a great lie, because they cannot arrive at a general world outlook without some sort of philosophy, without a philosophical element or a mythical element. Now, for example, they speak about black holes, about the Big Bang, and so on, and they create a world outlook from those data, physical data, and facts, and propositions, theoretical propositions, but this is a scam. They cannot create a world outlook without some philosophical element. Therefore, philosophy and myth creates wholes with partial knowledge, with the help of some parts of the world. Various mythologies start with different sets of those details of empirical facts. Those selections are different in different mythologies, but they construe with this insufficient knowledge those details. They construct or construe world outlooks, theoretical wholes, theoretical visions of the world, starting with insufficient knowledge, and this is true both of myth and philosophy. Therefore, those wholes or holistic visions are incomplete with respect to the entirety of all possible world outlooks that have been created in the history of culture, in the history of myth, in the history of humanity. So we may speak about partial wholes, and such wholes that are integrated from various different mythologies. And even then, this integrated world outlook, global world outlook, is grounded on insufficient knowledge, grounded on insufficient imagination, and it is open-ended. We may extend this world outlook, generalized world outlook or globalized world outlook, even further, if we further imagine and think and sing and dance and so on. And already Heraclitus said that there are no limits in human soul. You go in the sphere of the soul and you cannot find a limit. The soul extends as long as you go within the soul, in the sphere of soul, in the region of soul. Therefore, I think that those wholes that we encounter in mythology and philosophy are open-ended wholes. We start with insufficient knowledge about the world, and we continue in our journey of knowledge, of wonder, and we are left with this insufficient whole. We view it as complete and autarkic, to say it in Greek way, autarkis. But nevertheless, it is insufficient world outlook, and we should investigate and think and imagine further and go deeper into those mysteries of the world.